really great to talk with you and actually to have a conversation with the two of us, because I think we've been communicating by email quite a bit, and we've visited each other's webinars on various podcasts, and I'm looking forward to, and I'll plug also, in a couple weeks you'll be back on the ICMDA webcast.
That's right, talking about organs from animals, yes.
That's right. Okay, well, before we get into all of the good stuff, I'm going to have a little introduction. I'll read an introduction to everyone. This is Dr. Trevor Stammers, and he is currently the editor-in-chief of the New Bioethics, a journal published by Taylor and Francis. He's previously associate professor in bioethics and medical law at St. Mary's University, Twickenham in the UK. He practiced family medicine for 27 years before entering academia. He is currently writing a book on the ethics of organ acquisition and contributing a chapter on organ trafficking to a new book on human trafficking from Policy Press. His latest book, co-edited with Dr. Callum McKellar, is The Ethics of Generating Posthuman Persons, which is due out from Bloomsbury Academic in February 2022. And I'm very much looking forward to both of these publications, and I'm so thrilled. I'm absolutely delighted to have someone with your experience and knowledge to join us on this podcast. So I'm very much looking forward to having this conversation. And so why don't we set the table? A lot of the people who listen, watch, probably have heard about organ trafficking or human trafficking for organ removal. And so why don't you set the table for us and sort of describe what we're talking about, so people have a good foundation for what we're talking about here.
Okay, well, this may be one of the most complicated parts of our chat, because understanding what organ trafficking is about is quite difficult. So I think we've got one slide there to help listeners as I talk. Basically, organ trafficking consists of two separate areas, but overlapping. And so it's, and you can ignore the text around the diagram, it's just the overlapping circles in the middle. Organ trafficking is at the overlap between human trafficking and trafficking in organs, tissues, and cells. And it only forms a small part of human trafficking. Most of that is concerned with slave labor and sexual exploitation. About 5 to 7% of it is the trafficking of humans for the purposes of organ removal. So that's one element of it, but there is also an element of trafficking in organs that doesn't involve the transporting of people. So in the middle there, in the Venn diagram, you've got human trafficking for the purposes of organ removal, HTOR, and then you've got the trafficking of organs, of human organs as part of a broader offense of trafficking in organs, tissues, and cells. So even working in this field now for quite a number of years, I still find it quite difficult to explain. So you can understand how difficult it is to engage in legislation and research on this. If that didn't make sense, perhaps I will read part of the key defining texts for this currently, if that would be useful.
Sure.
Because I think it shows how the process of defining it has shifted. Now, probably the key instrument that focused on trying to control human trafficking as a whole was the 2000 United Nations Palermo Protocol. And that had a long definition of tracking in persons, which ended for the purpose of exploitation. Exploitation shall include prostitution of others or other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery or practices similar to it, servitude, or the removal and manipulation, implantation of organs. And some people thought at the time that that had sort of been added at the end as an afterthought. And so when the protocol was updated in 2018, organ trafficking and trafficking for the purposes of organ removal were separately defined. And I think that has made things much clearer, if not more concise. So I'm just going to read out the definition for trafficking in persons.
Sure.
Which is trafficking in persons for the purposes of organ removal is the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, receipt of persons by means of threat or force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, fraud, deception, the abuse of power, or a position of vulnerability, or the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person or having control over another person for the purpose of removing their organs. That's quite a mouthful, but it is, I think, a comprehensive capture of all the processes that are involved in a very complicated crime. And then organ trafficking, other than trafficking in persons, is then defined under 5 other separate offenses, which I won't go into here, but I think it helps to explain right from the start how complex and widespread this whole system of activity is.
Sure. Now, just so people can understand it, some of the people will be listening in a podcast form, and so if you want to hop over to the YouTube channel, you can have a look at this slide. But we're looking at we're looking at a Venn diagram with 2 circles that are overlapping, and you have human trafficking in one circle and OTC, and I'm taking that's organs, tissues, and cells.
That's right.
Yep. And then the overlapping part is the organ removal, is the human trafficking for organ removal. And so one of the things that strikes me about this is that you've got a separate phenomenon of organ trafficking as opposed to the human trafficking for organ removal. And then a second part to this you can help clarify is you've got cells and tissues in addition to organs listed there. So can you elucidate a little bit more about that actual cells are being trafficked and tissues are being trafficked? And what do you mean by that? I think that's something that most people don't even think about.
Yes, I think this is reflective of a division of how medicine works and how the law works in its classification of offenses. And one of the complexities here, I think, is that with an interdisciplinary subject, there is a kind of clash of cultures. The first part is probably easiest to explain. Not every criminal activity under this protocol and various other laws involving organ transplantation necessarily involves the trafficking of a person, the moving of the whole person with their organs across borders. The organs can be taken out in one country and remain there, and the person to whom they will be transplanted can move there. So that's the differentiation there. But of course, from the point of view of the motivation and the exploitation of the person from whom the organ is taken, doesn't make any difference whether, well, to some extent, as to whether they're moved to another country. And so the organ may be removed the recipient can move to that country, or the organ might be packed in ice and shipped off. And in the legislature to cover that, because it's just not solid organs, but also other tissues, and particularly reproductive tissues, it is a broader canvas, and it also covers cells as well, to make the legislation complete and neat and tidy. But it does make life difficult for us.
That sounds like an oxymoron, to have neat and tidy legislation. But actually, that's the, it gives people a taste for just how complicated it is. Human trafficking is complicated as it is, with it being international and this globalized nature. But then you've got people moving, the donors and the recipients, and tissues and cells and organs and things like that. It's actually absolutely fascinating. So do you have many more to? I'm sorry.
I think your reflection there just reminds me of a point to emphasize in this particular podcast, that means it's an area that gets overlooked from both viewpoints, because most organizations and journals concerned with human trafficking will have very little on organ trafficking in people for the purposes of organ removal, on HTOR. And in fact, a new journal I encountered as a result of being asked to do this podcast, the Journal of Human Trafficking, I think had only 2 articles in it on organ trafficking. So that's one aspect. But also organ trafficking and human trafficking for the purposes of organ removal also gets a raw deal in the legislation against human trafficking as well. And that's mostly cast in the form of punishing traffickers, whereas the protection of the system for doing something that's essentially good. I mean, organ transplantation is one of the greatest advances, I think, of medicine in the 20th century, and so it's essentially a good thing. It involves people who are trained to help others, and the criminal system for dealing with the other aspects it is not particularly refined at dealing with organ trafficking, I think.
Yeah, fascinating. Do you have more to say about this slide?
I think we've probably had quite enough to say about that slide.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've got, because you're also looking at, that the one thing I want to point out is you've got a spectrum of arrows. You've got living person on one side and deceased person on the other side, because when you think about human trafficking, we're often thinking about live people and then transported people, and that's what HTOR is. But then you've got the trafficking of just the parts of people, if you will, perhaps a post-mortem.
Thank you for pointing to the arrows. Yes, that's another big divide, of course, that organs for transplantation come from both the living and the dead. And by definition, the trafficking of human persons involves transporting living persons, although sadly, recent history here has shown that they may start the journey living, but end up deceased in the back of containers and so on. So it doesn't matter what the purpose, people can still end up dead. But a lot of the organ tissues, organ donation worldwide is from deceased persons, and they can also be legally or illegally used. So that's another important dividing point, not in the Venn diagram itself, but on the annotation.
Sure. Well, thank you for this. This is a very helpful slide, but I'm going to stop.
Complex, yes.
That. Yes, but I mean, it's up there for a while, and hopefully people have had a chance to really look at that well. But hey, we can talk a little bit about what the current incidence of HTOR is, and maybe would it be helpful for our discussion to keep it on HTOR, and or what do you think about that? I'm still learning as we're talking here.
Uh, for the figures, I think HTOR is clearer, and
Yeah,
let's talk about that as our sort of standard position. And if we begin to talk about trafficking of organs rather than the people with them, we can
sure.
specify.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but just to clarify for our listeners again, HTOR is human trafficking for organ removal. And that's when we're talking about people who are trafficked for their organs, as opposed for labor or sex or other things. And that was in that overlapping part of the diagram. And so just to clarify, so we don't lose people off the bat here. So, all right, thank you. Sorry for interrupting.
No, that's fine. So trafficking of people, even that, the numbers are very variable. This morning, I've seen two numbers of 2 million people trafficked a year, but other figures of around 600 to 800,000 a year. And I think this again emphasizes the difficulty of collecting statistics and with different definitions and so on. But I mean, we are talking for sure about hundreds of thousands of people per year. And all these figures are pre-pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect that now the numbers are increasing, and we may talk about that later. With regard to the US, 50,000 trafficked into the US each year is a figure that seems to be fairly consistent. And certainly the figures indicate that up to 3/4 are women, and up to a half will be children. So it's large numbers, but only, as I said before, about 5 to 7% of those will be for the purposes of organ removal.
Sure.
But that results in around 12,000 illegal transplants a year. It's reckoned about 1 in 10 organs transplanted worldwide per annum is trafficked, which is a staggering figure, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's most likely a gross underestimation. I mean, if we're thinking about other countries, like, if you go talk about China, they're not actually trafficking people. They're taking organs from people in their prisons, for example, and things like that. This is why it's so difficult to talk about numbers in human trafficking anyway, is just because how you define something that's, it's very difficult. Anyway, it's not that the numbers are important, but just to give people an idea about something that rarely hits any news cycle or even human trafficking circles. This is something it's a lot larger problem than people realize, and I think that's just the point.
It's a very embarrassing problem, and particularly for medics. And your reflection just there has just sort of taken me back to pre-pandemic. Just pre-pandemic, I was in Australia talking, amongst other things, about organ trafficking. And one of the senior Australian doctors who was on the panel with me had recently been out to China to do some teaching. And it was really quite difficult because I don't, I'm not wanting to impute blame, but clearly he was very embarrassed by my talking about China. And I have to say, I'm a declaration of interest. I'm on the UK committee for end transplant abuse in China. And it's quite clear from the China tribunal that was held here just 2 years ago. I went to some of the evidence sessions for that despite China's denial that it's doing these things now, The numbers speak for themselves. And when I was speaking about them, my Australian colleague was swiftly leaping to the defense of the Chinese and implying that it wasn't still happening.
Mm.
And it is so difficult when your life is engaged in teaching. I remember having to teach a group of Chinese students over here just pre-pandemic, and I said to the organizer, you know, do you mind if I allude to these things? Really complicated issues, and I did allude to them, and the students took it very well, I thought.
Yeah. Well, I think it's something that we have to. I mean, we you know, yeah, it's something, and it might cost a little or it might cost a lot, but I think we can't not we have to keep speaking up about this for sure. So can we? So why? Oh man, so many different directions to go now. We talk about like the medical community and why is this not, you know, sort of on the radar of a lot of physicians? Do you think it's because it's a, you know, it's a very niche part of a surgical specialty, or is it, are people just not aware, or what? Why is this doesn't seem to be hitting a nerve even in the larger human trafficking circles? That's not being talked about. Any ideas about that?
I think there are two elements, and one I've already alluded to, that the areas of criminology and exploitation of people, and the areas that most would link with medicine, including most doctors, of healing and helping, they are not a harmonious pair. So there's that kind of psychological barrier, I think. But I have thought a lot about the very stark issue of this is a crime that we could eliminate if no healthcare professional participated in it. That's quite clear. This is not something that the average bank robber is going to be able to do. It requires training and expertise. And so we have to face up to the reality that we are just like everybody else when it comes to, particularly in poor countries, or not. This is going on in some more wealthy countries as well. The lure of money and the pressure that can put upon people, and the pressure of whistleblowing on colleagues if we suspect that something is awry. And these are very difficult issues to face up to. I remember, if I can share this now, because I think it's relevant, being at a medical dinner way before I got interested in these issues, and a consultant sitting opposite me was chatting about how they'd been robbed recently. You know, ghastly experience if it's happened to you. But she then said, why can't other people be like us, meaning doctors? And it just happened that in the press that week, there was an oncologist who was in the press because he had poisoned his own wife. He'd murdered her with CCNU, an anti-cancer drug. So I said to her, you mean like Dr. X? and if looks could kill, I wouldn't be here today. And it was a bit naughty. I mean, I'm not, you know, I was more gung-ho in those days, but the point got across that we're no different in that regard from other people. So it's difficult. And we don't like to think of our tribe being involved in such matters, but some of the cases across the world are truly mind-boggling. I'll mention specifically the case in South Africa from about 10 years ago, where almost 100 people, I think, surgeons, nurses, hospital administrators, and so on, were involved in a massive exposure of a case of trafficked organs being transplanted. The Netgate case, it's often referred to, and you think, how could that happen? how could that happen? But it did.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we are human. We are fallible, and sometimes, yeah, who knows? But it does happen. Unfortunately, doctors are no saints. I know that. I learned that right away in medical school.
Well,
That's for sure.
this one certainly isn't, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. But perhaps, so let's go on to talk about transplant tourism. Uh, is this and how that's related to HTOR, and how, or is it, there's a connection between organ markets, transplant tourism, and people trafficking. Let's step into that whole mess. Why don't we?
Well, another one of my consistent themes is that although these things can be distinguished, my own feeling is that the Palermo Protocol and other protocols and declarations that consistently and universally allude to payment for organs being unethical, it taps into a common theme with organ markets, organ selling, transplant tourism, and at the very sort of obvious end of the spectrum of wrong of organ trafficking. And because they lie on a spectrum, I personally think that all of them need to be discouraged. But it is organ transplantation tourism is the other activity that is very closely allied to organ trafficking and often confused with it. Now, the first thing is to distinguish that from medical tourism. When I was a GP many years ago, family doctor in other words, I remember a patient who had told me they were going to India to have a CT scan in the early days when those were starting up. And to my amazement, she said, I can have a holiday in India and get the scan done for the price of paying for one in the UK. Now that's an example of transplant, of medical tourism. But transplant tourism has been defined most recently and helpfully, I think, by the Declaration of Istanbul 2018 version. And it says this: travel for transplantation becomes transplant tourism and thus unethical if it involves trafficking in persons for the purpose of organ removal, or trafficking in human organs, or, and I think this is the key part, if the resources devoted to providing transplants to non-resident patients undermine the country's ability to provide transplant services for its own population. So it's that detriment to local services, or the diversion of it. I think that's one of the key elements of that.
Yeah. So do you think that the transplant tourism is a driving factor? You think it's one of the major driving factors in this, or maybe not major, but definitely contributing?
The key driving factor is obviously the success of transplantation in saving lives. So if people are dying and they know that there is a treatment that can save their lives, that is a very powerful motivator for action. So it is not surprising that wealthier nations, where money can gain you virtually anything that you want, that will be expended in trying to save your life. So a lot of trafficked organs do end up in tourists, particularly going from Well, I happen to know a Japanese journalist who writes about the many people who go over from Japan to China, for example, to obtain organs that's very much to the detriment of where those organs have come from, and many people will not be aware. But even if they are aware and can do it, you can see how to save your life you'll do anything.
Yeah, sure, sure. And absolutely, I think on the flip side is just the lack of availability of transplantable organs. Is of
And
course, I mean, when you've got the people who want them, it's the demand and the need, and yeah, demand and supply, which is a
and that's something that I think is very clear. One of the papers from 2013 that I think you're going to be able to send out as a resource to listeners to the podcast very much focuses on dealing with this issue by removing the stimulus, by encouraging as much legitimate transplantation within a country as possible. And it's different issues in different countries that need to be worked on, and certainly in terms of getting an infrastructure and increasing the number of living and deceased donations. Probably Spain in Europe is a paragon of how to go about it successfully. But what works in one nation doesn't necessarily work in another. And one of the things that's puzzled me in my recent research about Singapore is that on paper, that's got an ideal infrastructure and an ideal system in terms of, or some would consider an ideal system in terms of being an opt-out system. So you don't have the inertia where you have an opt-in system.
interesting. Okay. So,
But
I mean, just to clarify for people, you're automatically an organ donor unless you say that you're not. Just to
correct,
clarify, instead of how it is most around the world that you have to opt into being an organ donor.
correct.
Yeah, just want to clarify that for people.
Although having such a policy can be counterproductive if you are determined to run it against the wishes of relatives. And Singapore did have a nasty incident that a few years back, but I think they've learned from it. But the number of deceased donations in Singapore is still far, far lower than the what one would expect of a country of that wealth, and in fact the average, I think too, it's lower. And that seems to be connected with what's usually described in the papers as religious reasons. And if you do have a faith system, even in which part of it may have reservations, for example, about needing to be buried intact, then this is something that has to be reckoned with and taken into account. And there's an important reason, I think, for not necessarily agreeing with it, but at least for religious understanding. And Singapore, I hope, will manage to work on that area, which clearly is causing a difficulty. I don't have a solution for it.
Yeah. Well, I think I think that, and so that just goes back to your point about being all kinds of different factors of religious and cultural, as well as the technical and infrastructure way of procuring organs, being able to do transplants, being able to do enough of them, having enough trained staff, medical doctors, nurses, facilities to do that all, as well as line up with people's willingness to say, yes, you can have my organ.
Yeah. And certainly another paradox is, and it's a very painful one, that as road traffic accidents are decreased and as road safety improves, your source of organ supply rapidly diminishes. So there's a big tension there.
Yeah, I heard one of our dark doctor jokes was that, one of our patients, now not real, but he had a terminal liver problem that was only going to be solved by a liver transplant. And he was asked, well, what he's going to do now after this diagnosis. He said he was going to lobby for the mandatory helmet law to be repealed for the motorcycle riders. So,
Yeah,
you know,
the dark side of medical.
that's right. I mean,
There's a reason
it's,
for it. Yeah.
yeah, probably just the two of us and a couple of doctors listening got that one. But anyway, um, yeah. So then you have, not to go down in the weeds of all this, but then on the other hand, you have countries like Iran, which it's legal to sell your organs, or you have other people advocating. So what's wrong with people, wanting to sell their organs? I mean, they're poor, they're destitute, why not? Come on. And I don't, this could be another hour-long discussion, but I think, it might be a question that some of us have as they're listening to this, is if they've heard instances or arguments like this. And so what really is, what's the problem?
Yeah, well, a very good question. And certainly in Britain, a leading university philosopher is one of the global cheerleaders for rubbishing the idea that people are being exploited if they sell their organs. And she is a very good orator, and reading her books, I sort of think, wow, I wish I could write like that. But I also think, what kind of planet is she living on? Because in order to maintain that position, you have to turn a blind eye to other writers like Nancy Shafer Hughes, is probably the US leading sort of exposer of the global organ trade. And in what country aren't people being exploited? Because I think the proposition that people will be better off and they wouldn't sell their organs unless they wanted to assumes that they will be better off. But certainly some of them don't see the payment at all. I mean, this is being done by criminals, not by charities. And there's a very recent paper that, in fact, you kindly informed me about, a 2019 paper about organ trafficking in Nepal, where one area of Nepal, I think 300 people in that one area alone had sold their organs, and at least 5 of them had died within a short space of time afterwards. And if you're not followed up properly, if you don't receive the money, then I don't know any other word for that than exploitation, I'm afraid. Now, Iran is always held up as the way forward. And Iran had been very successful in eliminating its waiting list completely. And with a state-run system, I'm sure that problems with not being paid and so on were not present. But there are questions surrounding Iran. And the biggest question I have is, could it work in different political systems to that in Iran? And if you want to hold Iran up as a world leader, then I take it that you'd be happy to live and move and work there. But, being perhaps slightly less cynical than that, the facts are that there are less donations from living relatives in Iran than there were before that system came in. And the global pattern of organs moving from the poor to the rich is still being replicated there. And, one can find this in the extensive literature that there is on Iran. So I simply wouldn't hold it up as being a model that the rest of the world is likely to get the same results. And even there are elements of it. Again, deceased donations in Iran are far, far lower than they could be. So once you start paying other less ethically fraught ways, get abandoned.
Yeah. And so, I mean, the results and the outcomes are simply not what people would have hoped for, given this, ideal, oh yeah, why not? But it actually doesn't work out that way. The poor are still being taken advantage of and oppressed and not being cared for, and it's not producing the number of organs that you would have hoped. Even if you had the disadvantages are this, but the advantages are there's more organs available, but it doesn't seem to be playing out that way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no utilitarian, but if I were, as I think the philosopher that I referred to is, on a utilitarian basis, I just cannot see that it works. You're not having the greatest happiness for the greatest number by people dying from lack of care after selling their organ and getting no money for it.
Yeah, and that really is one of the major problems with even the transplant tourism, when they don't know how these organs are being procured. And it's really the care after, even if they're getting paid, and even if they're not being trafficked, getting paid, they get what they want, or the trafficker or the procurer gets what they want, and then is left the donor to fend for him or herself, or tossed aside, not cared for. There's no follow-up.
Yeah, I think, to be fair, that's not something that is happening in Iran. I think the donors are well looked after, but that again makes it an exception in countries where money is exchanging hands for organs. Yeah,
exactly. So where do we go? I mean, where do we go from here? How can we motivate? I mean, obviously this is a topic just inherent in medicine, germane to the medical field. Is there something, maybe this question has two parts. What can we do about it? Maybe the lay person, the non-medical person, and maybe what is there for the medical field? Where do we go from here? What can be done about it? Maybe there's two different approaches. There's, I think the lay person thinks, I don't know, at least if you want an organ, or talking about awareness about transplant tourism, doing your homework, putting pressure on legislators, or making sure that they're not, if they are participating in this kind of thing, to make sure that they're not participating in illegal organ trade, that kind of thing. I don't know. Just take it.
Well, I think general points for any person listening, whether they're a healthcare professional or not, is to get informed. And so there will be a number of articles that are available, I think, after this podcast. But there is plenty of stuff on the web. And if you Google, as I did this morning, campaigners against organ trafficking, you will find a plethora of organizations. I even found an American site called Dressima, I think it was, where a lady in Iowa is raising money against organ trafficking from her dressmaking, or at least she was when that site went up. That was a new one for me. But there are organizations like Nancy Schaefer Hughes's Organ Watch in the UK and in other countries, and transplant abuse in China. And I will send to you a compilation of ones that I have found, and get on their newsletters. Even broader organizations like Freedom from Torture also do dip their toe in the water of organ transplantation. And then you'll sometimes come across organizations that you may think have got nothing to do with countering this. But if you're a banker or you're involved in economics, I see there's a magazine called ACAMS that has a brilliant article on it, on organ trafficking and countering the money laundering side of it, because that is also another piece of the jigsaw that I hadn't thought about. So getting the information there. Then if you're a medic, then I think there are a number of training organizations now that are out there. One has recently started in the UK called Vita, and I'll send information about that, and you may know some in the States, which will equip you to be more aware as a physician dealing with practical matters of encountering patients who may be thinking of becoming transplant tourists or have a trafficked organ, but also enabling you to be more savvy in engaging with medical bodies. And I realized this morning that I had never written to my own Royal College here in Britain. If you're a medical organization, you've got to have a royal patron. So I need to write to my Royal College and say, are we doing anything to educate our members about that? And also, if you are involved in renal medicine, wherever you are in the world, or just in hospital institutional medicine, asking your own institution, when did we last have, a clinical round or an update on this kind of thing? And this can be enormously useful in raising awareness and hence helping people thousands, millions of miles away.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's the nephrologists or the kidney doctors, the surgeons, but also the regular internal medicine or GP family docs too, as they have patients that are looking for kidneys or livers or corneas. Whatever is being transplanted. Kidneys, we use kidneys because that's the most common one. But just to help assess and do some screening questions as they have patients that are moving towards thinking about transplant or transplant tourism and things like that, and helping bring this attention when they're aware. Then they can bring attention to their patients who may not have thought about it until then they themselves need an organ, and talking about, hey, and then linking them up with these organizations about awareness or how to do this safely. Not just safe for the patient, but safe for the donors, and make sure that there's no illegality, or that the donors are being taken care of, that it's all above board and totally legit, and being aware of these things, and then increasing the communication and knowledge about, okay, and then even establishing networks of okay, who, if you are going to travel for certain things, maybe having international networks of connecting doctors who are aware of the problem and have their eyes open to where's a legit place to get one and where's not legit places and things like that. Anyway, just kind of exploring different ways, but I think we don't know. We won't know any of this until we start becoming aware of what the problem is and how pervasive it is, or aware of some of the warning signs too. Or you've got patients that have come back, maybe, return from someplace.
There is a silence in medical journals too. You just prompted me to think about that and letter writing to them. To give praise where praise is due, I think the Lancet in the UK and Transplantation, just one other journal, which both give regular coverage or as regular as it gets to these issues. And there is a brilliant 3-page article by Jessica de Jong in Transplantation on the very issue of questions to ask patients about all kinds of areas to just get a feel for whether there's something amiss with either where they're going for an organ or where they've had
Sure.
one.
Yeah, I mean, I purposely haven't get into the weeds of, you know, red flags and identification markers, things like that. That we will post that article for those of you who are more interested in that too. Yeah, but I think we really need to do a lot more. And thank you, really, Trevor, for all of your work in this area. Are there other things that we need to touch on? I mean, of course, I mean, I could think of a couple other things. We might be talking here for a couple more hours, but anything right now that you want to make sure that people know or aware of, or think about?
We've mentioned COVID in
Oh,
passing,
right.
but it is really
Sure.
important. That's
Yes.
the one
Thanks.
sort of burden I have before going, because I must admit privately in ETAC, most of the committee members in the UK felt that when COVID struck and travel essentially stopped globally, this would be a good thing for preventing both human trafficking for organ removal and organ trafficking in general. However, that was sadly misplaced for a whole variety of reasons as things have panned out. And of course, it's certainly a double whammy now, if not a triple whammy, in as much as many of the poorest nations of the world will be even worse hit by COVID, and those who are on the borderline of extreme poverty will have been driven into it. So the potential victims for traffickers and exploiters will have increased. But also, of course, COVID itself, and this, I think, amongst the general population, let alone doctors, is just not recognized. It doesn't only attack lungs, but also kidneys. And we had people dying in the UK because they couldn't get dialysis. This isn't being broadcast, but certainly renal physicians I know have told me that people have died under their care because they could not get dialysis or obviously a renal transplant because operations were ceasing. So there is now a greater range of potential donors. There's certainly a greater span of those in need of organs. And so I think we're going to see a huge expansion of this problem. And that's already been reflected early on in the pandemic in China, when in the January of 2020, as time flies, doesn't it? I think it was 2020. Or perhaps it was even earlier on than that. But at some point early on, China had been proclaiming that it had done the first double lung transplant for a COVID patient.
Oh, I remember.
And they had managed to get that organ within days.
Yep.
And normally you would need to wait years. I mean, I have a friend whose daughter sadly died of cystic fibrosis on the waiting list here. So this, you know, is very personal for me. Now, how does that happen without having a system of availability on demand, cross-matched and ready to go, you know?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Well, yeah. So, yeah, COVID has really complicated everything else about human trafficking. And so, of course, there's HTOR is no exception, and you know, and making everything worse for sure. Yeah. Well, that's a bright note.
Well, I was just thinking the same. I mean, on a happier note, opportunities, you know, like this, which might not have happened were it not for COVID. You know, the internet has a bad side of not being
Yep.
easily shut down, but it has a good side in being able to
Yes.
gain awareness, and people, I guess, will be listening to this or parts of it eventually all over the world. And so the chance to awaken awareness and stimulate action has probably never been greater.
I agree. And this is something that people really can, I mean, it is complicated, with, you know, donors and countries and third countries, and we didn't get into all of that. But I think it's something that we can get our heads around, and it's something that really can be stopped, or at least greatly diminished. And yeah, we just need to get more people on board and aware and actually caring to do something about it. And I really believe that.
Yeah, we have several members of parliament here who are cheerleaders for stopping this trade.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I met one in Australia when I was there
Yeah,
as well, doing a great
for
job. I'm
sure.
sure you have many in the States too.
For sure. Um, Yeah, well, I think we'll wrap that up. I think we've given people quite a bit to think about, and there will be loads of resources and articles and links in the show notes. When I'm done, I'll coordinate with Trevor and make sure that you have access to all of that. If you have any questions about any of this, please reach out to me. If you have a question for Dr. Stammers, and then yeah, reach out to me and I'll see if I can. He'll
Be very
be
happy to do
gracious
so.
enough. Okay, thank you.
No problem at all.
Yeah, and yeah, thank you so much. It's really been I learned something every time I talk to you about this and about other things. Look forward to seeing you again in a webinar coming up, and we'll be in touch. That's for sure.
Well, thank you for gently encouraging me to do this. I'm glad I did it. Thank
Well,
you.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad. And maybe we'll find something else to talk about in the future. It was a pleasure. Have a great weekend.
Thanks.
I'll